Okay, guys, recording now. So, this is Mudbox, and we're just going to walk through the interface and actually set it up so we can actually see what the controls are and such. So, for your character or the character or body that you're going to texture and render out in light, I'm going to give you guys the option of either Mudbox, Substance, or using both. Right now I'm just going to go over the interface for Mudbox and how to get started with it. So I'm just going to, let's hide this. So this is the Mudbox interface, and one of the things with Mudbox is that you have to start off with either a base mesh that it gives you, or you have to bring in a model as an FBX or whatever from Maya to bring in. I'm going to start off, I'm going to choose, and I would like you guys to choose the human body template. And there's the human body. And the first thing is, this is how it's so nice, is that it actually works like Maya. So Alt, or if you're on a Mac, Option, left mouse button rotates the camera, middle mouse button with Alt or Option pans, and right mouse button zooms in and out. Okay. So that's how I can look around my character. I can also put the cursor on an area and press F to zoom into that area. And that's a good way of getting, if you get lost or whatever, or you want to try and focus in. There's also the little box up at the top right that if you somehow move your camera around and get lost, you can click to home or front, different views here. So let's go over the interface. At the top left, we have these tabs. 3D view, which is what you'll be using the most. UVs, so if you're going to bring a model in as a base, I strongly suggest you UV map it first. It depends on what you're doing. We'll talk more about that later, but when you bring it in with UVs, so this is the layout in the 0 to 1 space of the default mesh. And that's clicking on that top left UV tab. The right is the image browser. This little guy is, if I'm going, if I have a folder of textures or images I want to use to either texture or sculpt or use as brushes, I can open it through here, and this is one of the ways, and then I can actually use it, set it as a stamp, a stencil, an image plane, and you see there's a lot of these different little options, and this is pretty cool because it allows me to pull in stuff. One of the strong points of Mudbox is that I can bring in textures not only to texture but also to sculpt, right? Over on the right, you'll see this panel here, and at the top it says Sculpt and Paint. So Mudbox works in layers both for sculpting as well as painting. So the painting works like Photoshop. You make layers, paint on top of it, and then you paint in different channels. So I could paint in the specular, the diffuse, emissive, all those. And then the sculpting layers, which we'll get into in just a few minutes, is where I could sculpt out details and put them on layers. So an example would be, I could actually sculpt this guy out as a guy before he was bitten by a zombie. And then on a few layers, I could sculpt out after. So I could sculpt in details like holes in his clothes, or, like holes in his mouth and where you could see the flesh and the bone underneath and all that kind of stuff, and have it on a layer that I could turn off and on, which is nice. It's also good for adding details like, oh, this sculpting layer has wrinkles. This sculpting layer has armor or something. This sculpting layer has scars, and I can turn those off and on. Okay. To the right of those, you see these tabs, layers, object list. This is all the things in my scene. So I have different cameras. I have lights based off of the default light set. We'll talk about that later. The default material on him, and the mesh itself. At any time, I could hide or turn off these guys. If I pull this out, check this out. So as I move this out, you could see more properties here. What level of subdivision is my character at, and what intensity is the light, and I could go in and just select and change these guys. I can also hide them, turning them off and on. See? Now, the viewport filters, let me tighten this back up. We don't need it this far out in most cases. Are filters that we can do that will help to show what the character looks like when it's being rendered, so, or just how it's being affected. So the tone mapper, we don't really have any colors on him or anything, so it's not really going to do much. Depth of field, and anytime I select or change things, you'll notice at the bottom, these are the properties that I can adjust. I could turn on what's called a cavity ambient occlusion, or an actual ambient occlusion. Screen distance. Normal map information. And the non-photorealistic renderer, which is basically if I wanted to give this guy, and I could tweak out these settings. If I wanted it to look more like a kind of a cartoon shape, so, or drawing. So I could actually adjust a lot of these settings in here and tweak it out. I don't really use it that much, but if I'm trying to get a more of an effect of a kind of cartoon stylized, if I were going for hey, I want this to look like Borderlands or something, then that might work out pretty well. Depending on your machine, turning some of these off and on can kind of chug your machine a little bit. So I'm going to go back to layers, sculpt, and then at the bottom we have two sections. We have the sculpting tools. We have these tabs, which are our tools. We have sculpting tools, which we'll be using, paint tools, obviously for painting, and you'll notice a lot of these are very similar and reminiscent of Photoshop. We have the curve tools, which is, this allows us to draw curves on the model for different reasons. One, I don't like doing it in here, but you can do a retop of the character inside a Mudbox. Topolization. So basically, when you start sculpting this character, if I press W right now, you could see the wireframe. You see that? So with the wireframe showing, you could see how the edge flow of the character is. Now, as I start to detail this character out, what's going to happen is you want the edges of the model to flow with the shape of the model, right? So, in other words, if this guy had armor, or if I radically change his arms, or, or different things like that, I would want these edges to flow along with those changes and not just be straight horizontal going across everything. So I would set up curves showing where do I want the primary seams to be, and then I could retopologize it in here. I personally prefer doing a retop in Maya, but in a pinch you could do it inside of here. But also I can create curves on the surface that would allow me to have the brush stick to those curves and use that to sculpt or paint. I have posing tools, which once again, you can do it. I'm not a huge fan of it because it's like a basic, like right now he's in what's called an A pose, not a T pose. And if I wanted to pull his arms out, eyes up front for a second, check this out. This is kind of funny. So I could create a joint, like right, let's say right about there, and pull it out so it reaches out to his arm, like this. And it's showing what's being affected, right? Now, if I try to now pose it, see what's happening? Kind of weird. So what I could do is I could paint weights. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how to. And say, you know what? I only want to affect the green area. So like if I went in and whatever area is green is what's being affected. So I don't want all this affected. So I would actually go in, oops, mirror, and just make sure that I basically make it that it's only affecting that area. I'm holding, don't worry about it yet. I'll show you guys in a little bit. I just want to demonstrate what it's doing more than show you how to do it yet. So I've painted the weights here so that now if I go in and try to pose it, yeah, you see it's still actually, yeah, that's just wrong on so many levels. So that's why I don't like really using it in here. Because you essentially have to, there we go, it's a little better. But you could see how it's, oh, that's, son, you got a condition. That's not right. So we just want to, that's the only part of that. I'm like, yeah, I'm not a fan of their posing. You could do little stuff in it, but it's, it has issues. If you're going to try and get it into like a T-pose, just bring it into Maya and we could set up a quick joint system and skin weight it so that it'll actually, you could get it in a better position if that's an issue. And then the selected move tools is basically how we would grab sections or the whole object and start to move it. This is particularly good when you bring in props, like if my character had a hat and I want to put it on, or sunglasses or things like that, and I wanted to scale them, move them, do stuff like that. And off to the right are things that you would use for your scene and your brushes. So the stamps can either be used to paint or sculpt. The stencils can be used to paint or sculpt. Fall off of the brush is what the brush tip is like. Material presets. Oh, this is an interesting one, because depending on how you plan on lighting your, and how you plan on painting your object, watch this. So as I change my material presets, it gives me different properties for my character. And you might find that when you're sculpting, one of these looks better, like the clay, which is very reminiscent of ZBrush, looks better than others. Okay. And all these properties can be changed. Okay. All right, so lighting presets. I could change my default lighting here, and some of them use a rough image-based lighting that you could set up. These will change how your character looks a lot. And finally, camera bookmarks, which you could set up similar to Maya, where you just set up bookmarks so you could keep going back to a same angle to render out or to work on certain areas. We'll get into the menus up top as we go along, but I just wanted to show just the general interface. Questions? Nada? Why don't I save this one?